We're joined in studio to discuss this by Newstalk's political editor Shane Coleman and Mick Clifford, a journalist with the Irish Examiner and the Sunday Times, both of whom were virtually cub reporters when the tribunal started sitting back in 97, but have been regular followers of these proceedings. First off, though, let's have a listen back to what Bertie Ahern had to say in 2008. The 2nd of April was the date when he was announcing his plans to resign.
I want everyone to understand one truth above all else. Never in all the time I served in public life have I ever put my personal interests ahead of the public good. I have served this country and the people, and I have the honour to represent in Dáil Éireann honestly. I provided more details about my personal finances than any person in public life who has ever held office. And while I will be the first to admit that I've made mistakes in my life and in my career, one mistake I've never made was to enrich myself by misusing the trust of the people. I've never received a corrupt payment, and I've never done anything to dishonour any office that I've ever held. I know that some people will feel that some aspects of my finances are unusual. I truly regret if this has caused any confusion or worry in people's minds. All of these issues arose in a period when my family, personal and professional situations were rapidly changing, and I made the best decisions I could in the circumstances in which I found myself. I know in my heart of hearts that I've done no wrong and wronged no one. I look forward to the completion of the tribunal's work. I'm confident that when it reports, the tribunal will find that I have not acted improperly in any way.
Well, that day has now finally arrived. That was Bertie Ahern speaking on the 2nd of April 2008, announcing his plan to resign outside government buildings. Shane Coleman, what have been Mahon's findings in relation to Bertie Ahern?
Well, I suppose two key findings, and we can go into the detail of what they've rejected in a couple of moments, but I think there's two key findings. Page 2481 of the tribunal report, it says those findings of fact which are adverse to Mr Ahern and on occasion to others clearly demonstrated that important aspects of Mr Ahern's evidence and the evidence of others were rejected by the tribunal. Much of the explanation provided by Mr Ahern as to the source of the substantial funds identified and inquired into in the course of the tribunal's public hearings was deemed by the tribunal to have been untrue. It goes on to say, it goes on to talk about the purpose of the tribunal's inquiries into Ahern's finances was to identify the sources of substantial lodgements and movements into the funds of Mr Ahern's bank accounts and other accounts associated with him within a specific time period, and by doing so to either establish or exclude a connection between any of these funds and Mr Owen O'Callaghan, either directly or indirectly. Now it goes on to say, regrettably, the tribunal's inquiries were rendered inconclusive for the reasons which I've already referred to, because the tribunal has been unable to identify the true sources of the funds in question. It could not therefore determine whether or not the payment to Mr Ahern of all or any of the funds in question were in fact made by or initiated or arranged directly or indirectly by Mr O'Callaghan and or by any other identifiable third party or party. So in summary, basically, they don't accept his evidence, but it's inconclusive as to where the money came from.
So what Bertie Ahern said on the stand in the tribunal and in that interview, that emotional interview he gave to Brian Dobson, where he said this was dig outs, this was friends who were helping me out, and we'll go through all of that in a minute. Didn't believe that.
They don't believe. Pretty much you go through all of the key aspects of Bertie Ahern's testimony, and we can do that now. They don't accept his evidence, and they don't accept the evidence of those close to him who backed up that story.
Mick Clifford, just going through that, I mean, the tribunal outlines in its executive summary each of those payments. I mean, let's first of all talk this lodgement of £22,500 Irish pounds to Bertie Ahern's special savings account on the 30th of November 1993. They rejected that this was a collection that was organised by Des Richardson and or Jerry Brennan, who were friends of Mr Ahern. They said that was what they heard in evidence, but that wasn't what they believed.
Yeah, this is what people might know as the first dig out, Jonathan. Bertie Ahern said at the end of 1993, the legal conclusion of the separation of his marriage. And remember, Mr Ahern accused a lot of people of dragging his personal life into this. He was the one who brought his personal life centre stage and gave that as the reason for his unusual financial dealings. Anyway, that had come to a conclusion. his story was that his solicitor, Jerry Brennan, who's deceased, and Des Richardson, who doubled as a Fianna Fáil fundraiser, came to the conclusion that he needed money to pay off his legal fees and those of his ex-wife, and therefore they did a whip around among friends. There was absolutely no documentary evidence to support any of it. They said all of the money was in cash, bar one payment. And that one payment came from a man called Pádraig O'Connor, who was a stockbroker. Mr. O'Connor gave, certainly from my vantage, very convincing evidence when he said he was not part of any whip around. He was approached by Des Richardson for a political donation. He consulted two of his colleagues, and that was crucial because he actually had his evidence was backed up by colleagues whom he told, this man's looking for a political donation for Bertie Ahern. Will we give it to him? A company donation, not a personal donation as was suggested. And they said they went ahead and they gave what he regarded to be a company donation. That evidence was crucial because as far as he was concerned, he certainly was not part of any dig out for Bertie Ahern. He also said he was not a friend of Bertie Ahern's and he didn't know any of the other people who were involved.
The tribunal accepting that point
completely
today, actually, his evidence not personal friends.
His evidence was completely accepted and it was very convincing. And it was all very logical stuff too.
Shane, one of the things they did actually accept was that Bertie Ahern had a very unusual way of dealing with his finances over the period. I think it was 87 to 93. This is the time he didn't have the bank account.
Yeah, they did accept that, but that was pretty much all they accepted. And Mick was talking about the first dig out there. They didn't just reject Bertie Ahern's evidence on it, they rejected the evidence of Des Richardson, his close associate, Charlie Chalk, Michael Collins, David McKenna, Jim Nugent. They were all people who were involved.
Michael Collins didn't give evidence. He was the one I think he was the man who was in Australia.
Well, the
rest of them all, yeah, he did. Unless he gave written evidence, yeah.
But the whole point as well, the Manchester dig out, there was a lot of discussion about this Manchester fundraiser that he was given £8,000 sterling.
The whip around, as it was euphemistically known.
And to give a quote there, the tribunal rejected the evidence of Mr. Ahern and of others to the effect that such collections had taken place and were the source of the funds lodged to Mr. Ahern's account on the 11th of October 1994. Very emphatic, saying that's not what they believe happened.
Yeah, they're saying that money lodged to the account, basically, I think Ahern's explanation, and Mick will correct me if I'm wrong, was that was from both the whip out and a second whip around, a second dig out. The whip around from Manchester and the second dig out, which apparently happened, which was according to Bertie Ahern, happened in the Beaumont house. Now they're saying second dig out didn't happen, the whip around didn't happen, and they're saying that money was actually 30,000 sterling in
25,000.
25,000 sterling.
The BT account, there was a lot of discussion in the tribunal about what this BT account was, and there was a withdrawal of £20,000 in cash, and interestingly the tribunal has concluded that remains unexplained. They can't explain what that is. What was that account, Mick?
Well, this is an account that was opened in 1989. £89,000 approximately went through it. Now, when it was discovered by the tribunal, Mr. Ahern and his Joe Burke, his friend and colleague, and Tim Collins all maintained this BT stood for Building Trust, that this is in relation
for St. Luke's.
For St. Luke's. The bank manager, who said while he didn't know for a fact, he always presumed that BT stood for Bertie and Tim, in whose names the account was held, Bertie Ahern and his friend Tim Collins, and also, which was kind of interesting, in a separate development, Tim Collins and Des Richardson had a joint venture some months previously, and they opened an account which was called the DT account, which was for Des and Tim. Now, you can read what you want to into that, but that's just an aside. So what they're basically saying is they don't believe in this building trust stuff. This was a Bertie Ahern, Tim Collins account that was for the personal beneficial interest of Bertie Ahern.
Let's talk about the Fianna Fáil reaction to this, because Micheál Martin was quite strong in this at the Ardèche, saying that there was going to be decisive action. There has been a statement from Fianna Fáil within the last half hour, Shane. It looks like they're keeping their powder relatively dry, at least Micheál Martin is.
Yeah, they're currently studying the report and its findings, saying they're going to make a considered response. Micheál Martin, the party leader, has convened a meeting of the party's officer board for later today to consider the report, and basically they're saying that tonight, following that meeting, Micheál Martin will issue a detailed statement, and tomorrow morning will hold a press conference to respond publicly. He's also written to the Clerk of the Dáil to ask that the report be forwarded to the DPP for consideration.
Let's bring in Darragh O'Leary, who's the Fianna Fáil spokesperson on justice. Darragh O'Leary, good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Jonathan.
First of all, can I ask for your reaction to this? I mean, did this go further than you would have feared might have been contained for your party?
Well, Clary Johnson, we're still digesting the report. It's 3,270 pages. We got it at the same time you got it. But, we're very disappointed. I'm very disappointed personally. The findings are very stark. But we are preparing a very whole response on behalf of the party, which will go to a specially convened meeting of the Office of the Board this evening. We will issue a detailed statement afterwards, and Micheál will do a very full press conference on it tomorrow morning.
What do you think should happen to Bertie Ahern?
I'm not going to comment, Jonathan. As I said, we have an Office of the Board meeting at the party this evening. That will agree a course of action. I'm not going to comment on any of the individual findings in the report. But just to say personally, I'm very disappointed at the overall language and the overall findings of the report. And
the fact that they didn't believe anything effectively that Bertie Ahern had said when he was on the stand at the tribunal, I mean, that goes further than just being disappointed, surely.
Well, look, Jonathan, as I said, we will issue a very full response. We've literally only got this in the past few hours. We will have a very full response following a meeting of our party office board this evening. Micheál Martin will be available tomorrow, and as Shane has said there, we've written to the clerk of the Dáil that this report will go to the Director of Public Prosecutions. We want time here in the Dáil next week to debate it. So we're tackling this head on, and we will take it head on, and every finding in the report that relates to Fianna Fáil and relates to our members, we will take it head on. Are
you going to take tough decisions if tough decisions are warranted?
Yes, we will not shy away from the findings of this report. Micheál Martin has made that very clear. And we will act on behalf of the very, very vast majority, the 99% of members of Fianna Fáil who are disgusted about what's in this report, disgusted what went on, and for those voters around the country who put their trust in Fianna Fáil representatives. The Fianna Fáil party membership are generally very hard-working, straight, honest people working in the interest of their community. We will act in their interest, in the interest of those who supported us over the years.
When was the last time you spoke to Bertie Ahern, Darragh Cleary?
It's probably about, it was before the general election in 2011, sometime towards the end of 2010.
Did you believe him when he told you his version of events and the version that played out?
Well, look, we never had that kind of discussion, and I'm not going to make any comment on anything until we publish the response this evening, Jonathan.
You're one of the younger breed. The Fianna Fáil will be looking to rebuild the party into the future. Now that this is out, I mean, this is obviously a cloud that was hanging over Fianna Fáil. Again, I appreciate the fact that you're only digesting this now, but you must be concerned about the damage this potentially could cause to that recovery.
Absolutely, Jonathan, I am. And what's in that report is stomach churning. It's absolutely stomach churning. The way in which the trust that people put in representatives over the years was abused, the way in which the trust our party membership put in people over the years was abused. And that's why I'm absolutely determined we're going to take this head on. But I know that determination and my determination is matched by Micheál Martin, and we will take this head on. And by the time you're on air tomorrow, you'll have a full sense of that response.
Are you angry with what Bertie Ahern is? Let's phrase it another way. Are you angry with what he did?
I'm angry with what's contained in the report by every single person who had the trust of the public placed in them, and every single person named in the report who has abused that trust. I'm angry because they've diminished all of us who seek to represent the public and to work for the public, for the good of the public. I'm very angry.
One of your colleagues, Thomas Byrne, has already gone on record saying it's hard to see Bertie Ahern staying in the party. Would you agree?
Look, I'm a member of the Office of the Board of the party. I'm the Honorary Secretary of the party. I'm not going to comment ahead of the meeting.
All right, well, appreciate that. OK, Darragh Cleary, Fianna Fáil Justice spokesperson, thank you very much for talking to us this afternoon. Non-committal really on what's going to happen next, apart from the fact that they are going to consider it. But really, Mick Clifford, it is very difficult to see how Bertie Ahern can be kept within the party fold, never mind the others that we're going to be talking about.
Oh, it is. And to be fair, there's another element to this too, Jonathan. In terms of the whole report, this is not exclusively Fianna Fáil. There were a number of Fine Gael councillors who've been mentioned in this and who've been suggested corrupt payments were being taken at the local level of councillors. Fine Gael were as much up to their neck in this stuff as Fianna Fáil. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not suggesting that all members of either party, quite the opposite. There was a minority in both parties, but there was a considerable number of councillors from both parties and a few from neither who were, according to this report, engaged in receiving corrupt payments.
But I suppose if there's a difference with Fianna Fáil, it's that this report goes to the very highest levels of the party, Jonathan. And there's a really, if I have time, there's a really fascinating little story in the Tribunal report where it talks of Tom Gilmartin, basically. And Tom Gilmartin gave this as evidence, but the Tribunal accepts it. Early February 1989, Tom Gilmartin has a meeting in Leinster House with the Taoiseach Charles Charles Haughey and a number of government ministers. So some of the most senior politicians in the country, including the Taoiseach. He comes out of that meeting, was confronted by an unidentified individual who proceeded to corruptly demand a payment of £5 million.
This was inside Leinster House?
Inside Leinster House in 1989. Now, £5 million is a lot of money now, but can you imagine in 1989 how much it is? And he was provided by that individual, according to the tribunal, with details of an offshore account into which the money was to be paid. And the tribunal clearly finds that this demand, which was not acceded to by Mr Gilmartin, was corrupt. Now, Jonathan, that's West Africa, corruption territory. That is really, really major corruption. So, I mean, some people were saying
it was the highest. This was the highest level. Let's not hold back. This is the highest level. This is people coming out of. Was it a cabinet meeting or?
It wasn't a cabinet meeting. Now, it's important to stress that it's an unidentified person, and we're not suggesting that any of the people in the room made that approach or were aware of that approach. It is important.
But it was still very high profile.
But it was a meeting of these, and when Gilmartin came out of this meeting, he was approached by an unidentified person.
Right.
And the other interesting thing about that is whether or not these individuals were in the room on that occasion, but of that cabinet, Charles Haughey, the Taoiseach, Pádraig Flynn, who held various portfolios, Ray Burke, who held various portfolios over the time, and now Bertie Ahern, although no corrupt findings have been made specifically against Bertie Ahern, all of them were part of that cabinet, and that speaks volumes.
I still have to talk about Bertie Ahern's house. I have to talk about Owen O'Callaghan as well, the property developer who was mentioned quite a lot in this report, and Pádraig Flynn you made mention of there, and the 50 grand, where did that go? All on the way. Stay tuned. This is Newstalk Lunchtime. This is Jonathan Healy on Newstalk Lunchtime, going through the 3,200 pages of the final report of the Mahon Tribunal. We still have to look at the councillors who are accused of corruption or found to have been corrupt. We still have to talk about Liam Lawler and Frank Dunlop, but Shane Coleman, let's talk about Bertie's house, Beresford Avenue, Drumcondra. There was a lot of discussion in evidence about this as well. Now we're a little bit clearer, perhaps not, as to who owned that house.
A little bit clearer. Bertie Ahern had argued that between 1995 and 97 it was owned by Micheál Wall. And Micheál Wall is the Connemara businessman who made good in England, who famously attended the whip around but didn't eat the dinner. He apparently drove the bus the night of the whip around. Now the tribunal is saying basically Beresford, the house, was never beneficially owned by Micheál Wall or intended to be beneficially owned by him. They're saying the property was beneficially owned by Bertie Ahern between 95 and 97 and was legally and beneficially owned by Mr Ahern from 1997 onwards. Now 1997, by coincidence or otherwise, was the year that Bertie Ahern became Taoiseach. The tribunal rejected the evidence of both Bertie Ahern and Micheál Wall, which indicated that basically that Micheál Wall had owned it first and then Bertie had bought it from him. Now, the obvious question that arises from that is, why did Micheál Wall, why was the house in Micheál Wall's name but beneficially owned for Bertie Ahern?
And they went to some lengths to make it appear like that, because Micheál Wall actually took out a mortgage for not the full total but for a large part of the cost of the house. So they went to some lengths to make this appear to be Micheál Wall's house. And remember, this is back in 94, before I think people find it difficult to realise now, but prior to 1996, in November 1996, Sam Smith broke a story about Michael Lowry and his house. And everything flowed from that in terms of Charlie Haughey, Michael Lowry, etc. And the atmosphere was created that opened up these corruption inquiries. Prior to that, this was largely regarded as no-go, untouchable area. Everybody suspected stuff for years, but nothing was ever came to the fore. In planning alone, there was 3 Garda investigations that not alone ran into the sand, but said that the reputations of the likes of Liam Lawler and Ray Burke were unimpeachable.
Those date back to the 70s
Those
as well.
date back to the 70s,
not the 90s.
74, 89 and 93 they were regarded. So remember, even in those times when a lot of the stuff that was going on was regarded as being largely untouchable, they went to some serious lengths here to disguise the ownership of that house.
Let's just roll back to the evidence that Bertie Ahern gave when he was on the stand. How many times was he on the stand, Shane? Was it 2 or 3?
Oh, he was on
No,
more than
more
that.
than that.
But different occasions.
Between September 07 and June 08, he was there about 4 or 5 times.
Right. The evidence that he gave, and this is what stood out for me when I was actually in the tribunal. I wouldn't cover the tribunal as much as either of you, but the evidence that he gave was very different to the Bertie Ahern who was the politician on the outside. He was much tetchier on the stand. I mean, the interaction that he had with counsel for the tribunal, that never came across because it wasn't televised. I mean, you would have done your best to try and explain it in words, but you never quite got the edge that was in Bertie Ahern's answers, and now we understand why.
Oh yeah, and I mean, because it was again and again, the tribunal were probing these stories that were completely bizarre. And Bertie Ahern's attitude seemed to be, look, I'm telling you this is the way it was. Why do you not believe me? Yet any time the tribunal had records, whether they be bank records or donation records or whatever, they practically all were in conflict with Mr Ahern's evidence. And crucially, that of about 14 other witnesses whom the tribunal said they didn't believe. And huge questions arise there. Is it possible for 14 or 15 people to independently give evidence that's not believed, yet there be no element of organisation or conspiracy there? I mean, I think that's a huge issue.
And let's not forget Bertie Ahern's reaction when the one time the tribunal actually produced bank records that directly contradicted his evidence and Gráinne Carruth's evidence, Gráinne Carruth being his secretary. A lot of people in Fianna Fáil were deeply uncomfortable at the position he put Gráinne Carruth in, but Bertie Ahern's response to that, low-life stuff was how he described it sometime later to the press.
They're certainly a lot more uncomfortable now that the report is finally out. 12:30 is the time on Newstalk Lunchtime. We'll talk about Padraig Flynn and the 50 grand next tribunal. Jonathan Healy on Newstalk Lunchtime discussing the Mahon Tribunal's final report with Shane Coleman and Mick Clifford. We're joined on the line now by Fine Gael Parliamentary Party Chairman Charlie Flanagan TD. Charlie, good afternoon to you.
Hello, Jonathan.
Your reaction, please, to this report.
Well, this was a pretty damning report, but I feel it was always going to be that. It took a long time, cost a lot of money. People were critical on both counts, and I think we need time now to absorb its contents in excess of 3,000 pages. A lot of work went into it. We need to be calm and reflective in terms of our response, but we need to ensure that the recommendations contained in the report are fully complied with, and if there is wrongdoing in the report, which there clearly is, that would be further pursued.
It isn't wrongdoing, of course, all on Fianna Fáil's part. There's Fine Gael councillors mentioned in here. I'll just pick out Councillor Tom Hand, the late Councillor Tom Hand, the tribunal accepting evidence from Frank Dunlop that a payment was made to him that was corrupt. So it's not fair to lay all the blame at Fianna Fáil. There were members of Fine Gael who were involved.
I made no such...
no, I know you didn't, but I'm putting the point to you, Charlie.
Well, I mean, you're putting it to me before I even get a chance to say it. We can look at the scale of wrongdoing, but listen, of course I accept the fact that there are issues to be faced by other parties, including my own party, Fine Gael. We're currently looking at the report in some depth. Government is responding as we speak. There are a number of other bodies to which the report will be referred, namely the Director of Public Prosecutions, the Gardaí, the Standards in Public Office Commission, the Revenue Commissioners, the Criminal Assets Bureau, the Garda Síochána. So, I mean, this is far from over, and I wouldn't be rushing to any judgment. I have been looking at the report. The party will take a decision on any matters that are identified in the report, some of which you have already mentioned. You can take it that this will be fully consumed by Fine Gael in a way that will ensure that nothing like this ever occurs again.
Can I just ask you one question briefly? It cost an awful lot of money. You made reference to its expense earlier on. Was it worth it, Charlie Flanagan?
Listen, the purpose of the tribunal was to make findings of fact. It wasn't concerned with finding anybody guilty of criminal behaviour. I've heard some commentators express disappointment that people haven't been found guilty. They were never going to be. Yet at the same time, the negative findings of the tribunal against people like Bertie Ahern and others, they are really a powerful deterrent against wrongdoing. And even though people aren't currently serving in high office, nevertheless, we should draw lessons from the lengthy tribunal report. We should change legislation. We should ensure that the culture of comfort between planning and politics
is it gone? I mean, that culture. Are you satisfied now? Can you put your hand on your heart and say that all of your colleagues within your party, within your government, are not engaging in any of the types of corrupt practices that have been highlighted in this report? Have we moved on to the point at which you can say that with absolute confidence?
Oh, I'm absolutely confident that we have moved on. Nevertheless, Jonathan, I'm a public representative. I'm currently chairman of the Fine Gael Parliamentary Party. I'm not a judge. I'm not a member of a jury. I'm certainly not an executioner. But what I am saying to you is that we are looking at the report, that the Fine Gael Party will take a decision over any matters to which reference is made in the report, and we will act fairly swiftly on it. But I'm not going to prejudge anything. What I can say, as a member of the Parliament, as a member of the Dáil, that we will be debating this issue next week, and furthermore, we will be acting on the recommendations. And as a member of a government party, I will really be impressing, along with my government colleagues, the need to ensure that the recommendations in this report are acted upon.
Fine Gael's Charlie Flanagan, thanks very much for talking to us. Charlie, just on the issue of the councillors, Mick, when you read through the section that's referencing the councillors, you keep seeing the word corrupt, corruption, detailing small amounts for a lot of the time, but the decisions that they made based on those small amounts paid off massively for others.
Oh, hugely. I mean, they made multimillionaires out of people overnight. In fact, having covered it, it always struck me as they sold themselves off very cheaply in terms of the amount they allowed their votes to be bought for. But, I mean, beyond that, there's another issue. And Charlie Flanagan there, with the greatest respect to him, seems to say that corruption to a large extent isn't going on. And I would accept that in terms of legal corruption. But to my mind, the system is corrupt. I mean, for example, you can still have a situation whereby a developer gives a donation to a councillor, and we've seen that it can be done in particular ways that it doesn't have to be declared, and there being no suggestion specifically of a favour, yet there being an understanding. And this has happened time and time again. That much abused phrase, pro-development, was used by a lot of councillors, and in a lot of instances here, payments were not corrupt as defined by the tribunal, but the system, to my mind, is morally corrupt in that you can have a situation whereby you give over so-called political donations, no suggestion of a specific favour, yet there been an unspoken understanding.
Judge Alan Mahan, Jonathan, comes down very firmly on this, and he cites an example from 20 years ago where Albert Reynolds and Bertie Ahern in September 1993 wrote to Eoin O'Callaghan looking for a donation to Fianna Fáil. Now, there's no doubt it was a donation to Fianna Fáil, but Judge Alan Mahan says the tribunal was satisfied that Mr O'Callaghan felt himself compelled to make this payment to the Fianna Fáil party in circumstances where his company was actually obliged to use borrowed funds in order to do so, because of his concern that a failure on his part to contribute would impact negatively on his efforts to secure government support.
So that was the system.
Yeah, he was trying to build a stadium at the time, he said, and basically it goes on to say the tribunal considers the concept whereby senior members of government would seek a financial contribution to the political party with the assistance of a former minister or whatever is entirely inappropriate and an abuse of political power and government authority. And I think Mick is right. Once you have a system whereby political parties can seek donations, there's always at least going to be the perception that it's some kind of quid pro quo, even where that isn't actually the case.
Shane Coleman and Mick Clifford still with me as we go through the findings of the Mahan report. Let's remind ourselves again of Bertie Ahern back in 2008. In April the 2nd, he announced his plans to resign.
All of these issues arose in a period when my family, personal and professional situations were rapidly changing, and I made the best decisions I could in the circumstances in which I found myself. I know in my heart of hearts that I've done no wrong and wronged no one. I look forward to the completion of the tribunal's work. I'm confident that when it reports, the tribunal will find that I have not acted improperly in any way.
Bertie Ahern not issuing a statement so far today, considering the report's findings, but Shane Coleman, effectively what the tribunal said, that pretty much everything he said in the stand when he was there, didn't believe him.
Absolutely. It didn't believe the digouts, it didn't believe the whip around in Manchester, it doesn't believe his story on the house and how Micheál Wall owned the house, it doesn't believe his evidence and the evidence of others in relation to the BT account, which Bertie Ahern was claimed was an account for administering and running St Luke's, and not the Bertie and Tim Collins account. On all those issues, the tribunal says we don't accept his evidence. What it isn't in a position to say is, it basically says that it's inconclusive as to whether or not there's any connection between the funds received by Bertie Ahern and Eoin O'Callaghan, as alleged by Tom Gilmartin, and of course denied by Ahern and Eoin O'Callaghan, but basically says not in a position to determine basically where those funds Bertie Ahern came from, but very, very damning for Bertie Ahern, no question about it.
Let's talk about what Fianna Fáil do next, Mick, because we had Derek Leary on the programme earlier on, very non-committal. They're meeting this evening to discuss it, but you have to form the opinion that they're going to have to follow through on Micheál Martin's promise from the Ardèche that very stiff action is going to be taken, and that probably means Bertie Ahern being kicked out.
Yeah, it does. And, you know, on one level, Bertie Ahern is a beaten docket. I think most people in the country, most people in Fianna Fáil have made up their mind about him and that's to do with his stewardship of the economy. And I'd have to say as well, he's also in certain instances a handy scapegoat for others who were there at the forefront in terms of the economy and what have you, and they're all running out, it was Bertie. But in relation to this specific, yeah, they will. Micheál Martin has a problem though. In the introduction, the Mahan report makes reference to interference by Fianna Fáil ministers when Mr Ahern was on the stand, and that effectively suggesting, I haven't got the exact quote in front of me, but effectively saying they were trying to undermine the tribunal and get it to run into the sand. Now, Micheál Martin was one of those ministers. So was Willie O'Dea, so was Eamon O'Cuive. The others have left the stage. They're all, to that extent, implicated in this by that finding of Mahan's in the introduction, that while Bertie Ahern was giving evidence in the media, and you can go back over the record,
there was a very staunch defence of Bertie Ahern.
Absolutely.
By his cabinet colleagues.
And in at least two instances you had ministers who said effectively that the tribunal was biased. And Alan Mahan, in a different context, suggested this was saying that the judges there were crooks. None of them ever brought their concerns to the floor of the Dáil. They threw it out into the media and let it out there to try and curry favour. Micheál Martin was at the heart of all that, and he has a bit of an issue there.
Liam Lawler, the late Liam Lawler, of course, his name intrinsically linked with this tribunal. He died in a car crash in Moscow before, I suppose, the tribunal reached anything resembling conclusions for him. But very damning insofar as the tribunal found that Liam Lawler abused his role as an elected public representative and as a TD to a very significant degree. This isn't a surprise, really, but to see it written down in the final report.
Yeah, there's so many findings on him, and the word corrupt is used quite extensively, including it talks about his corrupt relationship with Frank Dunlop and with Owen O'Callaghan, which is, I suppose, more of a surprise. But yeah, that I don't think anyone is going to be surprised by that, or by the findings in relation to Frank Dunlop. Although I think there will be some eyebrows raised, Jonathan, about its finding that the tribunal is satisfied a sum of in excess of £500,000 available to Mr Dunlop for his lobbying endeavours in between 1990 and 1993.
This is what they refer to as the war chest.
The war chest. Now, they say £500,000 was a conservative figure and probably considerably less than the actual war chest, as you refer to it, which Mr Dunlop had available to him during the period of 1993 development plan. Now, that just shows, if that's the war chest, that money going to councillors, that just shows the level of profit that was available for these rezonings, and that it cuts to the chase again about governments failing to make decisions. Back in 1973 there was a report that came out, the Kenny report, that could have eliminated this kind of profits, and governments, successive governments, Fine Gael led governments, Fianna Fáil led governments that the Labour Party were part of, did not follow through on that, and we're kind of reaping the harvest of that today.
Just one interesting element to Dunlop's evidence, what's interesting, I think, is that in some instances the report finds that they accept his evidence, in others they don't, and in yet a couple they also say that he was mistaken, or they believe him to have been mistaken in identifying particular councillors in relation to something. It's just very interesting. It wasn't a case of Frank Dunlop got up there and gave his evidence and the tribunal were willing to drink it all in and take it as read. They've obviously parsed his evidence very closely to see where there might be problems, and they've pointed out those problems.
One other very serious issue which we haven't got and which we should highlight, and the tribunal raised this. It talks about this Garda investigation that took place in 1989. Of course,
this is the one that ran into the sand.
Yeah, well, there was a number of Garda investigations. They all ran into the sand, and if they hadn't, we mightn't have had to spend €300 million on an inquiry. It basically says that complaints made to that 1989 Garda inquiry by Tom Gilmartin about Liam Lawler and about Redmond, the former county, the assistant county and city manager George Redmond, were not thoroughly investigated. Now, it suggests that Lawler's position as a TD was a likely reason for that, but it goes on to express its puzzlement at the lengths the inquiry went to exonerate Liam Lawler and George Redmond.
I just want to bring some breaking news from Owen O'Callaghan, the man who has been implicated in a lot of this report. A statement just come in saying that he wants to make it clear that he utterly rejects the findings of the Mahan Tribunal and that he intends to seek their judicial review in the High Court. The tribunal, he says, reached its conclusions based on procedures that by any reasonable criteria have been biased, unfair and unjust. He also says the findings of the Mahon Tribunal against him, having regard to the evidence given at the tribunal, are simply not sustainable. So look, Shane, this is going to go on. Eoin Callaghan has always professed innocence in relation to this, that he has done nothing wrong. He's now going to bring it to the High Court. So this is going to drag on legally.
It's going to drag on, and obviously without in any way knowing how those findings, how that's going to pan out. There is some track record of as I mentioned earlier, the Supreme Court being very critical of the modus operandi of the planning tribunal in an earlier phase of it. So it'll be very interesting to see what happens.
Yeah, he makes reference to Mr. Justice Adrian Hardiman's criticisms of the tribunal, which you referenced earlier on, saying that they are remarkable and trenchant. Just what did Mr. Justice Hardiman say? He
basically said it was the wrong way to go about investigating. He said the powers of the tribunal were far too strong. He also specifically focused on the modus operandi of the tribunal, particularly in relation to evidence given by James Gogarty, and how that evidence was used and how certain parts of that evidence was not used by the tribunal. It was an absolutely fascinating and damning verdict by Justice Hardiman at the time.
Padraig Flynn, we mentioned earlier on, for those who missed it, in relation to him and claims by Tom Gilmartin that he'd given Flynn 50 grand as a donation for Fianna Fáil when Flynn was the Environment Minister. We played a little bit of audio, contentious audio that many people remember from the Late Late Show when Padraig Flynn gave an interview to Gay Byrne. Have a listen.
I never asked or took money from anybody to do favours for anybody in my life.
But you know Gilmartin?
Oh, yeah.
You know Tom Gilmartin?
Yeah. I haven't seen him now for some years.
I see.
I met him. He's a Sligo man who went to England, made a lot of money, came back, wanted to do a lot of business in Ireland. Didn't work out for him. He's not well, his wife isn't well, and he's out of sorts.
But you're saying you never took money from anybody at any time for any reason?
I never took money from anybody to do a political favour insofar as planning is concerned.
14 years later, we know, Mick Clifford, that 50 grand ended up in Padraig Flynn's pocket.
Yeah, they've accepted totally Tom Gilmartin's version of events. He was put under some duress, told that if he wanted to get his projects through, he would have to make this donation. He was told to leave the payee blank when he went into Padraig Flynn, who was Minister for the Environment, with a cheque for 50 grand. That money ultimately ended up being invested by Padraig Flynn for his personal benefit in farms that involved, I think, a number of forests up around County Mayo somewhere.
Lads, we have to move on because the day's other news has to be touched on before we finish up on the programme. But just same question to both of you. Two questions, really. They are linked. Number one, was this worth it? Was it worth 15 years, 300 million of taxpayers' money? And number two, what happens next, Shane?
No, it wasn't worth 300 million euros, and it should have been done a different way, but it had to happen. Planning was a devalued currency in Europe and in Dublin, and had been for some time. This, at the very least, has blown the lid on the corruption that existed there, and we are better for that. As regards what's happened, previous tribunal reports, what's happened is pretty much nothing. We've all moved on and forgotten about it in a few days. But if we're serious, if we're really serious, I don't believe, brown paper envelopes are being handed around to anything like the extent that they were 20 years ago. But if we're serious about really tackling corruption and having a proper planning system, you have to take away political donations from individuals and from companies. There must be full state funding of political parties. Otherwise, the temptation is always going to be there.
Mick?
The other element to that is, I think I heard Dermot Ferrer, the historian, once describe the Kenny report as one of the great missed opportunities of Irish political life. I think that is spot on. There was a report there for anybody who wanted it, nearly 40 years ago, that could have ensured that an awful lot of this would not have happened, because there would not be this situation whereby simply councillors are in a position to make multimillionaires of people overnight at the stroke of a pen. That goes to the heart of the problem.
And for so little gain. The point is, and it's pointed
out,
it's 1 grand, 2 grand,
but they're only the corrupt ones, Jonathan. The system whereby, even no matter what it is, whether it's political donations, whatever, the fact that people are vested with that kind of power and they're put in that position is absolutely crazy.
Mick Clifford of the Irish Examiner and the Sunday Times, our own political editor. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us in the studio.